But if you've got your Bible, I'm going to ask you to turn with me to Exodus chapter 4 this evening. We were looking in Exodus chapter 3 last night, if you were here, when I was hearing all these announcements and about come and get your credit card and come and get your prizes. And I thought, is there anybody sitting behind me? So I turned around as if some of you. So many people seem to have gone home. But if you weren't here last night, we were looking in Exodus chapter 3. God meeting with Moses at the burning bush. And the particular aspect we talked about last night was when God said, take off your shoes, for you're standing on holy ground. Holy ground means set apart ground. Moses, I want your shoes set apart, that I can work in you and through you and work in your shoes. But in Exodus chapter 4, still at the burning bush, Moses answered in verse 1, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say the Lord did not appear to you? And the Lord said to Moses, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. That's as far as I'm going to read. I'm coming back to this, of course. When God met Moses at the burning bush, he asked him for two things. The first was his shoes that I talked about last night. Because God is saying, Moses, it is I, God, 8 times, I have heard the cry of my people. I have come down. I will deliver them. I will take them to land flowing with milk and honey. I, God, will do it. But I'm going to do it, Moses, in you. Give me your shoes. And I challenged you last night, and my own heart is challenged. Have we given our shoes to God? Tonight I want to point out to you a second challenge that God asked Moses for. He asked him for his staff. What is that in your hand, Moses? And Moses probably had to turn and look because he was so familiar with what he held in his hand. It's a staff. You see, Moses was a shepherd. He'd been a shepherd for 40 years. And a staff was the basic tool of his trade. It represented his livelihood. It represented his income. It represented his security. It represented his purpose in life. For 40 years, he has got up every morning and taken that staff and gone out to do his work. What is it, Moses? My staff. It's my whole life is wrapped up in what this symbolizes. God said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it down, and verse 4 tells us, Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake, and he ran from it, something now of which to be afraid. Previously it was a harmless tool that he carried every day. He probably put it by his bed at night when he went to sleep. But I doubt he ever did that again. Maybe on his Saturday afternoons off, he let his kids play with his staff. Something that appeared to be simply harmless, a means to an end, a tool for his trade. Now it's become something deadly of which to be afraid. And so he ran from it. And then the Lord said to him in verse 4, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. I don't know if you know anything about snakes. I lived in Zimbabwe in southern Africa when I was a young man. I just left school when I got a job there on a big farm, and I was managing the livestock of that farm, and I was there for a couple of years, and I met a lot of snakes. And one of the things I learned about a snake is that you never do what God told Moses to do. You never take a snake by the tail. You take a snake by the tail, and its head is loose. That's the dangerous part. And it'll even come up its own body and make contact with you, you'll start to get a little dizzy, you will fall over, and you will die. If you're going to take a snake at all, you take it by the head. We had a lot of snakes in Zimbabwe. I killed quite a number. It was either them or me. I remember once having a boomslang, which, if a boomslang bites you, you're dead in 20 minutes. Fortunately, its fangs are at the back of its mouth, so it has to get hold of something like a finger or a toe, but it knows that, so it'll go for that, and it'll inject its venom into the tip of your finger, and in 20 minutes, you'll be dead. And I had a boomslang that lived in the thatched roof of the house that I stayed in. And at night, I would hear it slithering across the ceiling. And when I came out, often it would be sticking out like this, straight, and sunning itself. And as I came out to my door, it would sort of bend itself up, look at me, I guess, and go back into the thatch. And one day I came out of my door, and he was out sunning himself like this. He didn't this time move up and look at me. He just stayed like that. Maybe he'd become familiar with me. So I went back into my house very quietly and got a rifle that I had, came out, lifted the barrel as close as I could to his head, and I pulled the trigger, and his head disintegrated. It was a wonderful moment for me. I fought with several cobras, spitting cobras who spit. They get you in the eye, you're blinded, and they know that, so they aim accurately for your eye. I don't know who told them. Aim for the eye, but they know. Once I was working with a blow lamp and was trying to repair something, and there was this cobra curled up in a little box. I had no idea, this was in a workshop, and the heat of the blow lamp scared him. He came out, neck flattened out in the attack position and went to attack me. All I had was my blow lamp, so I kept the blow lamp on his head. And I fortunately burned his head and killed him. You know, in chariots of fire, they melt. Well, they don't. They cook, and they smells like a barbecue when you finish. But I killed him. It wasn't me, it was him. One day I came out of my back door, and there was a python skin on the grass. I'd never seen a python. The skin was about 7 feet long. And I thought, wow, amazing, a python skin. And I did a little bit of calculation. If there's a python skin, they shed their skin every once in a while. If there's a python skin, somewhere there's a python. So we looked for it and couldn't find it. And later that day, I was in my kitchen and I opened a cupboard. There was a cold water tank at the back of the cupboard, and there was a python curled around the cold water tank to keep himself cool. So I quickly shut the door. Went and got a friend of mine who knew a bit more about snakes. He came and had a look and said, you know, they only eat about 3 times a year, and I don't think he'll be hungry for another couple of months. So you should be okay. Until then, I think by then he would have moved on. And pythons are not poisonous, they're constrictors. They just wrap themselves around you and just squeeze you down, and then they swallow you whole. Well, I didn't have any choice. I couldn't just pull it off. But I came into my house the next afternoon, and the python was in my kitchen. He was down one wall, bent and leaning across the other, and behind his head, what looked like a loaf of bread, big lump. It wasn't a loaf of bread, it was my cat. He had eaten my cat. And so we got rid of him. And I have never been a friend of snakes. But you never take a snake by the tail, as God told Moses to. You take it by the head. Once I had one, I held behind its head in my hand, not a very thick one, but he was a few feet long, and he wrapped himself around my arm like this. And I wasn't sure what to do, but I didn't say this, but I could say, snake, you think you've got yourself wrapped around my arm, but I've got control of your head, I've got control of the poisonous part. and I banged his head on a brick, and he died too. So I'm sorry if that concerns you. In the snake world, I am a murderer. I hate snakes, and it's no surprise to me at all that the devil disguised himself as a snake. I think that's exactly the best thing for him to have done. But snakes are interesting. Why does Moses' staff turn into a snake? One of the ancient symbols of Egypt is the cobra, and usually with its neck flattened out, coiled, ready to strike. I have been in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and impressed with how often a ready-to-strike cobra is the symbol of power in Egypt. The mask of the mummy of Tutankhamun wears a cobra on his crown. We don't know exactly when Tutankhamun was around, but it was around Moses' era. And the cobra was a symbol of Egypt's power, of Egypt's might, of Egypt's authority, of Egypt's deadly poison against the people of God. And when God said, Moses, you take it by the tail, what he was saying, I suggest, was this, and I'll give you a reason for saying this. He's saying, Moses, that staff represents your livelihood. You're thrown on the ground. It's become something dangerous. It's frightened you. You've run away from it. Now you take it by the tail. That's the harmless part. If you take it by the tail, I'll look after the dangerous part. And it became a staff again in his hand. And it says, so Moses reached out, took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. But here's what's important. It was not the same staff anymore. It looked the same. It felt the same. If he took it home that night, his family wouldn't notice any difference. But it's not the same staff, because in chapter 4 and verse 20, let me read you what it says. At the end of the interview at the burning bush, it says, so Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand. It used to be the staff of Moses. Now it's got a new name, a new identity. It's the staff of God. Now we know that initially God did this to demonstrate to Moses that he was powerful, and that this was to be demonstrated to Pharaoh, because in chapter 4 verse 5, this said the Lord is so they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. And in chapter 7, if you look there, Moses and his brother Aaron went to Pharaoh, and they threw the staff down on the ground, and it became a snake. But Pharaoh's magicians said, that's nothing. We can do that. And they took their staffs, threw them on the ground, and they became snakes. I don't quite know how they did it. But then Moses' snake swallowed up all of their snakes. You remember that in chapter 7? But there's something about this story that is significant. That this staff is a symbol of a transaction that has taken place between Moses and God. And it was to be the evidence that God had set him apart. Let me read you in chapter 4 verse 17, when God sent him back to Pharaoh. He said, take this staff in your hand so you can perform miraculous signs with it. Then in chapter 7 and verse 15, it says, go to Pharaoh in the morning, and as he goes out to the water, wait on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Don't take any staff, Moses. Don't go and pick up another one because you're scared of that one. Take that staff, the staff that was changed into a snake, and from then on, this staff becomes an extremely useful tool. I'll show you why. You remember the plagues that were to follow? We won't look at those details, but accept this detail in chapter 7 and verse 19 and 20. it says that the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, because Moses and Aaron did this together, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and stone jars. And Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. So here's Moses saying to Pharaoh, let my people go. No, I won't let the people go. All right, says Moses, I'm going to take this staff. This is the staff that was turned into a snake. And I'm going to strike the Nile. And all the water of Egypt began to turn to blood. It was the first of the plagues. Every river, every canal, every bucket even, every sink, every glass of water, had turned to blood. Then in chapter 8 and verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, this is now the second plague, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. And so Aaron stretched out the staff, and suddenly frogs were everywhere. They were stuck in the taps. They were sitting in the coffee cups. Everywhere they went, there were frogs. It was the second plague. And then in chapter 8 and verse 16, then the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground, and throughout the land of Egypt the dust will become gnats. This is the third plague. Take your staff and just stir up dust with it, Moses. And as you do so, every particle of dust will become a gnat. And there was a plague of gnats that invaded the land of Egypt. And actually it's interesting that when that happened in chapter 8 and verse 19, the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. What are they talking about? Talking about the staff. This is the finger of God. We've noticed when Moses holds it over the canals and rivers, they turn to blood. When he strikes the water, frogs become everywhere. When he stirs up dust, every part of it becomes a gnat. This thing that Moses holds in his hand, they said to Pharaoh, is the finger of God. And then down in chapter 9 and verse 23 and 24, when Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail and lightning flashed down to the ground. This was the fifth of the plagues. This is the seventh of the plagues. When Moses holds up his hand, and thunder and lightning. And then in chapter 10 and verse 13, Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt. The Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all of Egypt. This was another plague, the plague of locusts, when Moses held his staff up over Egypt. Don't you think his staff is significant? And then when they come to leave Egypt, after the final plague with the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian family, and the Israelites were set free, they set off, and in chapter 14, we talked about this last night, they came to the Red Sea and couldn't cross over. And in chapter 14 and verse 16, God said to Moses, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so the Israelites can go through on dry ground. And he held out his staff, and the waters were opened, and they went through on dry ground, as God had said. When they got to the other side, in chapter 17, they had no water, no drinking water. And in chapter 17 and verse 5 and 6, the Lord said to Moses, walk on ahead of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go, I'll stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses took the staff and struck the rock with it, and suddenly water is gushing out, enough for all the people to drink. And then later in chapter 17, they met the first enemy, the Amalekites. And I know that David McFarlane talked about this at the banquet the other night. And it says in verse 8, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua gets the army, goes and fights the Israelites in the valley. And Moses stands with his staff in his hand, And when the staff was held in the air, the Israelites prevailed against the Amalekites. And when the staff began to droop, the Amalekites would prevail against the Israelites. When Moses got tired and just need to rest a moment, the Amalekites would begin to overwhelm the Israelites. So he'd lift the staff up again. And maybe, I'm sure he had some fun with this staff. He'd look down and say, well, they're doing well at the moment. I can relax a bit. Oh, here's an Amalekite coming. Oh, got him. Held the staff in the air. Eventually, Aaron and Hur had to prop him up and so that he could go on holding the staff in the air. This is a magnificent piece of equipment, wouldn't you think? Later, as you may know, it was kept in the Ark of the Covenant. There were three things kept in the Ark of the Covenant. The tablets of stone, on which were written the Ten Commandments, the gold jar of manna, containing manna, symbolizing God's provision every morning, fresh, new every morning, through the wilderness years, and Aaron's staff that budded. Without going into all the details now, Aaron's staff had been Moses' staff, and Moses had given it to Aaron. Remember an event in chapter 16 of Numbers, when the people came to Moses and they complained and said, you've gone too far. We are holy enough, they said. And 250 well-known leaders rose up in rebellion against Moses. Moses said to the people, the Lord will show you who he has chosen. They said, who do you think you are, Moses? You and Aaron set yourselves up there. We didn't choose you. The Lord will show you who he's chosen. He said, I want you to bring a staff, one representing each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Aaron will represent the tribe of Levi. And they brought their 12 staffs in total. They put them in the tabernacle. And Moses said, all right, now you can go home and go to bed. Have a good sleep. In the morning, come back and meet me here. In the morning, they came back. And they went into the tabernacle, and all 11 staffs, apart from Aaron's, were exactly as they had been left the night before, but Aaron's had budded and blossomed and produced almonds. What was he saying? What was it saying? What was God saying? He's saying there is life in this staff. See, when God sets somebody apart, you know it because there's going to be life that comes from their ministry. Not noise, not excitement, but life. People are transformed. But this was the staff of God. I mean, what a magnificent instrument. Wouldn't you like a staff like this? You know, where you can go down to the river and just strike it and say to your enemy, now we'll see what happens, huh? It's changing color. Notice that? Going red. Go home and look in the buckets at home. Hold it over the waters and frogs become everywhere. Stir up dust and every particle becomes a gnat. Hold your staff in the air, there's thunder and lightning. Hold the staff over Egypt and locusts come and hail comes. Meet a Red Sea you're unable to cross. Hold your staff over the water and the waters will part. You get to the other side and there's no water for the people to drink, so you take that staff and you strike the rock. And water comes out of the rock. And you meet your enemy and you stand with the staff of God in the air, demonstrating victory over the enemies of God is never won, it is only received. As Moses holds the staff in the air. Wouldn't you like a staff like this? You can have one. Where'd you get it? In exactly the same place Moses got it. When God says to you, what is that in your hand? Will you throw it down? You see, in your hand, it could potentially be dangerous. God exposed, it's a snake. But you take it back. If I give it you back, you take it by the tail. You hold the harmless part, and I'll look after the poisonous part. And what you have laid down before me, if I give it you back, is now going to be the staff of God. It's going to be the symbol of God's presence, God's power. And I ask you tonight, what is in your hand? Well, some of you might say it's my ministry. I'm a pastor, an elder. I'm on the board. I teach a Sunday school class. I'm involved in the youth ministry. I teach a Bible class. I go on short-term missions. And God says to you, will you lay it down? Will you drop it? You say, well, it's where I gain my income. It's the security for my family. Will you drop it? If it's right, I'll give it you back. But if it's not right, I'll give you something else. But the issue is not whether it's right or not, but will you drop it is the issue. Will you give it to me? You see, in ministry, if you don't lay it down, it'll become your work, your church, your ministry, your youth group, your program, and you'll feel the right to have your agenda, and we have no right to any agenda but that which God gives to us. You know, most churches are born in a spirit of a real awakening of God. I mean, churches don't come into being apart from that. Nobody ever founds and plants a liberal church. But Christendom is riddled with liberal churches. Why? Because what God began, people took control of. John Wesley was a great evangelist, and in his years in the 17th century, in the 18th century in Britain, brought the greatest revival in British history, and there haven't been many revivals in British history, but John Wesley was the source along with George Whitefield, and John Wesley left behind a thriving, living, exciting church that knew how to preach the gospel, that knew how to lead people into a deep walk with God. You look at Methodism today. There are pockets around that are good, but by and large it's dead. Because people took it into their own hands and said, this is mine. I have a right to decide what happens here, rather than holding it loosely and putting it at his feet. What is that in your hand? You might say, well, it's my profession. I'm not a pastor. I'm just a Christian, but it's my profession. I worked hard to get where I am. It's a good job. It's a respectable job. It's a noble job. God says, will you drop it? And if it's right, I'll give it you back. But you go back into your workplace, back into your office, back into your factory, back into your school, back into wherever you are, and it will not be your job, it'll be God's job, and that'll be the place where He's going to work in you and through you. Of course, He may take it away. He may send you to the mission field to exercise the same skills, but without a salary this time. That's His business, not yours. What He's saying is, whose hand? Who's holding it? Will you give it to me? What's that in your hand? You saw it's a piece of paper. I've just got my degree. I've got my qualification. I've trained for this for many years. And God says, will you drop it? Well, I've spent years getting this. Well, you throw it on the ground. If it's right, I'll give it you back. But if it isn't, I'll give you something else. But the point is, will you drop it? I may use your qualification in some far-flung corner of the world. Somebody actually came to me not very long ago and said to me, I want to serve God with my gifts. I said, that's great. He said, I'm trained in classical piano. I love playing the piano. I'm a pianist. Done concerts. I'm gifted. I'd like to use this for the Lord. I said, what if the Lord isn't interested? And he said, well, I'm sure he would be. He gave me the gift. I said, it's not your gift he's looking for, it's you he's looking for. I mean, if he sent you up the Amazon River in a canoe, where are you going to put your grand piano? It won't fit. He may well take your piano and your musical gifts, but will you give it away to him so he has the right to give it you back if he wishes to, or the right to take it away if he wishes to? And do something else with you. What's that in your hand? You say, it's my possessions, it's my money, I've earned every cent. Well, I hope you did. But you know, the snake is extremely comfortable in the love of money. We're told it's his favorite resting place. For the root, love of money is the root of all evil, says Paul. So that sounds very dramatic, but it's true. Will you lay it down? Will you give me access to your bank account? Of course, I may allow you to go on living as you are, but will you ask me about it? That's the point. I may want to move somewhere else. Maybe a missionary you need to adopt. What's that in your hand? You say, it's my family, they're a gift from God. Well, that's true. Will you drop them? What do you mean? Will you let your home be a place where God reigns? Not just a place to escape to, but a place where God is and God reigns. Will you say to God, please help yourself to my children. If you want them to go to the far corners of the world, and I hardly see them once every few years, don't really get to know my grandchildren. That's up to you. Because you see, when you give it to God, and that's tough sometimes as parents to just on our knees say, Lord, we give you our children. When they do come and say, I'm going to go and serve you on the mission field, you're not taken aback and try to persuade them to do something else. We have 3 children, 2 of them are heading for the mission field. I know the idea is costly. We're not going to see them very often. But we gave them to God years ago for that very purpose. So we'd love them to stay at home. We'd love them to be around. We'd love to see our grandchildren every week. But they're not ours. They're yours. It's the staff of God. You will make them such a blessing. What's that in your hand? You might say, well, it's my girlfriend's hand. It's my boyfriend's hand. I love her. I love him. Will you drop them? I mean, do it gently. Because you might be holding the wrong hand. You might say, well, I'm 32, and if I don't get this one, I mightn't get one. I've had that conversation before with a friend of my wife's some years ago who brought her fiancé to meet us. We never met him and stayed with us for a couple of days, and we immediately instinctively felt uncomfortable with him. And my wife said to her, are you sure? Are you absolutely sure this is the right thing? And she said, well, if I don't marry him, I'll probably never marry because I'm already in my mid-30s. And she married him. And they've been through the most painful of divorces. There are 3 children whose lives have been shattered by it. You see, you might be holding the wrong hand. But God won't force the issue. He didn't force that girl to do something else. I don't want to presume to know what was the right thing, but this marriage didn't work and it didn't surprise us. But if you want to keep the girl, let me just remind you something. You keep the girl and you'll keep the snake. You don't know when it will uncoil. In fact, if you keep any of this, you will keep the snake. If you don't lay down your ministry all the time, again and again, God, this is yours, I give it back to you, you'll find yourself holding the snake. And you don't know when it will uncoil. But he will make his move, of that you can be sure. What's that in your hand? Well, it's myself. I've never given myself fully to God. Will you lay yourself down and say, Lord, I give myself to you with no strings attached, no conditions, just yours. If I live, climb 99, that's your business, that's fine. If I die tomorrow, that's your business as well. When Jesus said you must deny yourself and take up your cross, to deny yourself and say what happens to me is unimportant. That's what denying self isn't giving up sugar or giving up, ice cream. People talk about self-denial in those kind of terms. Well, that may be a healthy exercise, but that's not what Jesus was talking about when he said, if you want to be a disciple, you must deny yourself. But you must come to that point and say, what happens to me is irrelevant. We're not looking at this, but the context when Jesus said that was when he had told them he was going to Jerusalem to die. And Peter said, never, Lord, this will never happen to you. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, you're a stumbling block to me. Unless you deny yourself and take up your cross. Peter, I know you want the best of me when you say to me that you're not going to let me go to Jerusalem and die on a cross. But unless you, Peter, too, are willing to go and die on a cross. The Christian life is not about self-fulfillment other than an incidental consequence that comes with it, but it's about self-denial. What I am, who I am, what I want, I give away to him. I've been reading in Acts, and just this morning, in this last few days, and this morning reading about Stephen, being crushed to death. One of the brightest stars in the Jerusalem church. Great preacher, you read his sermon. And when he was dying, he looked up and he saw Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father. And you ever thought about this before? Stephen, being stoned, saw Jesus standing on the right hand of the Father, and Jesus didn't lift a finger to help him. He let him die. There was a young man standing nearby, too young to throw stones, looking after the coats and cheering everybody else on. His name was Saul of Tarsus. I did a study some years ago on the apostolic preaching in the book of Acts, about 19 sermons in the book of Acts, or fragments of them. And Peter and Paul have a very different way of preaching. Peter's preaching is that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. So this is that which was spoken by the prophet, and he'll point out a verse and Jesus fulfilled it. Paul doesn't do that. He presents Jesus as the goal of Old Testament history. Everything from Abraham on was leading towards Christ. But when you realize that about Paul, and then you read the sermon of Stephen, that's exactly how Stephen preached. And I think Stephen's message left an indelible mark in the heart of Saul of Tarsus. It came to fruition on the Damascus Road when he met with the risen Christ. But Stephen, deny yourself. Take up your cross. And that's the invitation to us. And we know, of course, exactly who the snake is, because from Genesis to Revelation, he makes his appearance. In Genesis 3, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals. He came to Eve and said, did God really say you shall eat of the tree of the garden? He begins in the very beginning of the story. And he makes his last appearance in Revelation chapter 20. That ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan. And though he's not in every book in that form, from Genesis to Revelation, Satan is the serpent that raises his ugly head, always to be destructive, never to be your friend, even though he tantalizes and offers stuff that looks good, but which is always poison. Do you know why Moses was used to change his world? I suggest the two things because when he met God in the burning bush, 80 years of age, living as a failure because 40 years ago he had killed an Egyptian thinking he was helping God in his work. But it was all Moses' effort, and ran out to the desert, spent the next 40 years looking after sheep. It was because when he met God at the burning bush, he gave him his shoes. If you have an agenda, God, you take my shoes. You can walk in my shoes. In every place, God said to him, the soles of your feet will touch, will be yours. Why? Because God will be in your shoes. Told him that in Deuteronomy. He repeated again to Joshua. The other thing was, he said, what's in your hand? My staff, my livelihood, my source of income, my family's security. What gets me up in the morning to go to work is symbolized by this staff. It's the basic tool of the shepherd. Moses, throw it down. And I'll shock you. There's a snake in that staff. And you didn't know. Take it by the tail. I'll look after the dangerous part, and I'll give it you back. And you find yourself unable to cross a Red Sea, don't worry, hold up the staff. You run out of water, take the staff, strike the rock. You meet an enemy, hold the staff of God in your hand. Because this symbolizes now that this is not Moses doing things for God. This is not Moses' ministry, not Moses' life, not Moses' agenda. This is God's ministry in him. And there's power in that. And as we finish, and I know God has spoken over the days of this convention, I have only been here on these 2 evenings. I have listened to some things online. You mentioned they were online. I listened to David McFarland's first message just to get a flavor, and I listened to some of the discussion and questions, and I won't comment on those, but it's been intriguing and interesting, and I sense a kinship with so many of you. But I wonder if at the end of this conference you're holding tightly something you need to let go of. It may be your church, your ministry even. Lay it down. If he takes it away, that's his business. He'll have something else. If he gives it you back, it's not yours now. It's the staff of God. And there'll be a fresh power, a fresh authority you've not known before. And I'm going to ask that we just bow to pray, and then if God has spoken to you and there are things in your life you need to lay down, I'm going to ask you to come down here to the front. And there'll be those who will meet and pray with you. And I guess we could all say there are things I need to go on giving, but if there's something very specific tonight, and God has spoken to you about it, or over these 3 days, God has spoken to you about a blockage in your life, you need to let go. It mightn't be a bad thing. It might in itself be a good thing. But it's in the wrong hand. It needs to be in his. Then I'm going to ask you to come to the front as an indication of that. Somebody will pray with you and help you to let that go and release it, that God may have a fresh way in your life and fresh power. And you go back to your homes, and you go back to your churches, and you go back to your factory. If that's where you work, go back to your business. Go back to your street. With a fresh authority in your life. Because everything has been surrendered fully and reservedly. Let's just pray together.